A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
The rabbi recently published an article addressing the question of whether Rosh HaShana should be celebrated in Israel for 1 or 2 days. The holiday of Rosh HaShana is commonly celebrated nowadays by Jews in Eretz Yisrael for 2 days. Has this always been the case?
The Rif, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, who lived during the 11th century, writes at the beginning of Masechet Beitzah, he goes out of his way, in fact, to stress that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael must keep Rosh HaShana for 2 days. Anyone familiar with the style of the Rif and his aim in writing his Sefer Halachot, namely to quote only the most essential statements, halachic statements of the Talmud, and to be posek the halakha, to express his opinion as to what is the final halakha based on the Talmud. And anyone who's familiar with his very brief style, where he does not address any extraneous issues, is immediately aware that there has to be a reason why the Rif goes out of his way to do so. And the reason, in fact, is very simple, and there's no secret about it. And the reason is laid out for us by another one of the great Rishonim, Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi, known as the Baal HaMaor. He was one of the Mefarshim, one of the Chachamim who wrote commentaries and disagreed with the Rif on certain issues. He writes regarding the Rif's statement about the requirement to keep Rosh HaShana for 2 days in Eretz Yisrael. He writes that this is the opinion of Rabbi Gaon, who was from Bavel, from Babylon, and that the Rif is continuing in his footsteps, but he also points out that this was not the historical reality. In other words, the Baal HaMaor, the Razah, Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi, says that for a period of approximately 800 years, from the time of the institution of the fixed calendar, which was in the mid to late 4th century, according to the Christian calendar, and up until the mid or late, perhaps, 12th century, for a period of approximately 800 years, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael kept Rosh HaShana for 1 day, just as the Jews of Rosh HaShana have always kept all the Yamim Tovim for 1 day, as is the case down to this day, for Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, etc., with the exception of Rosh HaShana, which today is commonly observed for 2 days. And the reason for this disagreement is explained by the Razah, and he explains as follows. He says, and this is agreed to by all. By the way, the historical reality is not under discussion. Everyone agrees and knows that this is what was going on in Eretz Yisrael during the period of the Geonim and during the time of the Rif, and that is why the Rif bothered to deal with this issue, because he saw that he knew that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael were keeping Rosh HaShana for 1 day, and he did not agree with this position. And the Razah quotes a question sent by Rav Nisim Gaon from Kairouan, North Africa, today in Tunisia. He sent a question to Rav Hai Gaon at the beginning, probably at the beginning of the 10th century, approximately, and in which he asked Rav Hai Gaon, why do you claim that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael should be keeping Rosh HaShana for 2 days when we see with our own eyes that they are keeping Rosh HaShana for 1 day? Rav Hai Gaon explains in his response to Rav Nisim Gaon, this is all quoted by the Razah, that it is true that when the months were decided, the new month was decided by and declared by the Beit Din, by the Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael, and Rosh HaShanah being at the beginning of the month, It is true that in Eretz Yisrael there were two possibilities. Within Eretz Yisrael, there were those who were either in the town where the Beit Din met or in the environs thereof, who knew that today had been announced, had been declared to be the beginning of the new month, and therefore Rosh HaShana, and they would keep one day, whereas the rest of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael itself, regarding Rosh HaShana, not the other Chagim, but just Rosh HaShana, would not be aware of this fact till after the event, and therefore they would not know if the 30th day of Elul had become the first day of Tishrei or the 31st day, which would then be Aleph B'Tishrei by default if no witnesses came to announce the fact that they had seen the new moon. And therefore, within Eretz Yisrael you had these two minhagim, you had these two practices, those who kept one day and those who kept 2 days, depending on where they were. And seeing that a majority of Eretz Yisrael kept Rosh HaShana for 2 days, because most of the Jews were not near the Beit Din and could not be aware of this fact, therefore, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim says, in my view, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael today should also be keeping 2 days, as did the majority in ancient times. The response of the Razah and others who agreed with him was that this is all very well at such a time when the months were being decided and declared according to witnesses and declared to be so by the Beit Din. In other words, when there was Kiddush HaChodashim al Pi Ariyah. But when we have a fixed calendar, that is to say from the 4th century onwards, and therefore there is no doubt as to the day on which Rosh HaShana will fall. It's fixed ahead of time, years and even centuries ahead of time, and we know exactly when the first day of Tishrei in any given year will be, and therefore there's no doubt. Therefore, all the Jews of Eretz Yisrael are in exactly the same position as those Jews who were in the same town as the Beit Din or nearby found themselves in ancient times. In other words, they were aware, without a doubt, which day was Rosh HaShana, and therefore they should act and observe Rosh HaShana as did those Jews who knew without a doubt that today was made Rosh HaShana. So there we have the two explanations, the two svarot for these two practices, for these two halachic opinions. A, that the Jews in Eretz Yisrael should keep 1 day of Rosh HaShana, and B, that they should keep 2 days of Rosh HaShana. However, the historical reality, and this is not debated by any, not challenged by anybody, everybody agrees and admits, including Rabbi David himself, that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, in practice, were keeping Rosh HaShana for 1 day. And the Razah makes it clear that this was the practice, historically, for many centuries, going back to the time of the fixing of the permanent calendar, which means, and up to his own day approximately. He says that just before his own time, the situation changed in Eretz Yisrael because of the arrival in Eretz Yisrael, apparently in the mid-12th century or late 12th century, because the Razah himself passed away in the year 1186 according to the Christian calendar, and he says it happened in recent times, so it probably happened within his lifetime, probably even less than a generation before his own time. He says that a large number of great halachic scholars, Torah scholars from Provence, the south of France, arrived in Eretz Yisrael, and they essentially imposed their halachic view based on the Rif, that they should keep 2 days on the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they didn't leave the Jews very much choice. And this itself raises a very interesting question, and that is this how halakha can be and should be decided? Can halakha be decided by strong-arm tactics? I say strong-arm tactics because it is clear to me that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, who had been keeping Rosh HaShanah for 1 day for 800 years, did not volunteer to change their practice, and would not have done so if they were not under duress. They must have been more or less forced into accepting this position. It's also clear, I think, that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael did not that is to say the laymen, the average Jew on the street in Eretz Yisrael, did not decide off his own bat how many days of Rosh HaShana he would keep. He decided to keep Rosh HaShana precisely according to the instructions and the halakha as given to him, as laid before him by the Chachamim of Eretz Yisrael for centuries upon centuries. In fact, I think it's clear that the Sanhedrin, at the time of Rabbi Hillel HaNasi, who established the fixed calendar, it was they who apparently instituted and laid down the halakha that Rosh HaShana, like all the Yamim Tovim, should be kept for one day once we have the fixed calendar.
According to what the Rav says, it seems that both positions can be explained as having some rationale behind them. Do you feel that one position is more reasonable than another?
First of all, let's examine those two positions again. The position described by Rav Hai Gaon in his response to Rav Nisim Gaon is that when the months, when the Chodashim were done according to Re'iyah, based on the testimony of witnesses, at that time in Eretz Yisrael most of the Jews kept Rosh HaShana for 2 days simply because they did not know which day was declared to be Rosh HaShana, the 30th day of Elul or the 31st day, which of course wouldn't be the Elul, it would be the first day of Tishrei. Whereas those in the Beth HaWa'ad, that is to say the town, the area in which the Beit Din met, and the places nearby, the Jews there would be aware if the Beit Din declared, shall we say, the 30th day to be Rosh HaShana, and then they would keep 1 day of Rosh HaShana. Rav Hai Gaon's explanation is, or his claim is, that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael today should continue and maintain the minhag avotehem, the minhag, the practice of their forefathers, because the majority of their forefathers in Eretz Yisrael were keeping 2 days of Rosh HaShana in ancient times. The position of the Raza, the Baal HaMaor, and others is that that was the case when there was still doubt, there was a possibility of doubt for a majority of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, and then it was entirely correct for a majority of them to keep Rosh HaShana for 2 days. But when there is no doubt, when we have a fixed calendar as we do today, as we have had for over 1600 years, then there is in fact no doubt, and all the Jews in Eretz Yisrael are in the same position as the Jews in the area of the Beit Din once were. If you ask my personal opinion which of those two arguments is more convincing, I would tell you that the argument of the Raza, that when there is no doubt, then all Jews in Eretz Yisrael are in the same position as the Jews and the Beit Din themselves and the Jews in that area were in ancient times. I would say that argument is more convincing. But I think that the most cogent argument for suggesting that this issue be reappraised is the historical reality that existed for 800 years. As I said before, no one challenges the fact that for 800 years the Jews of Eretz Yisrael kept Rosh HaShana for 1 day. That is to say, from the advent of the fixed calendar until the time of the Baal HaMaor in the 12th century, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael were keeping Rosh HaShana for 1 day, and this is agreed to by all. This is also, by the way, proved and supported by the fact that in the ancient Midrash, the Psikata de Rav Kahana, where you have drashot for every Yom Tov, every holiday of the year, for Rosh HaShanah there is only one such set of drashot, not two, which indicates clearly that there was only 1 day of Rosh HaShanah, not 2 days. The reason I mention this is because the Rambam, when discussing when Shnat HaShmitah, the sabbatical year in Eretz Yisrael, falls, he explains that one could approach this matter in 2 different ways. And he explains the position and the 2 possible approaches to calculating when Shnat HaShmitah falls. And then he goes on to say that when you have more than one possibility, but you have an historical reality on the ground, as he himself describes, that all the Goanim and all the Jews of Eretz Yisrael have always known and claimed that they know with certainty that this year is Shnat HaShemitah and not the other year according to the other calculation, when you have such a fixed and well-established practice on the ground based on ancient tradition, in other words, something which has been done from time immemorial, and the Jews of Eretz Yisrael have always kept Shemitah, and therefore they know when Shemitah is to be kept, they know which year is Shemitah, then that fact should tip the scales in favor of that calculation of Shnat HaShemitah, which agrees with that position, not the other approach. The very same thing here should apply with regards to Rosh HaShana, except that even more so. In the case of Rosh HaShana, this is something that is done every year. It's unlikely that people would forget from year to year how many days of Rosh HaShana they kept the last year, whereas Shemitah is something which is done once every 7 years. And yet, the Rambam says that we can rely with certainty on the clear and certain knowledge of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, who have always practiced Shnat HaShemitah, and they know when Shnat HaShemitah falls, and their tradition overrides the other possible way of calculating Shnat HaShemitah. The same applies here with regards to Rosh HaShana. Even if we have these two positions, both of which can be supported by way of rational argument, the historical fact remains that for 8 centuries, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, and that is to say, without a doubt, there's no question in my mind, I don't think any reasonable person could doubt, that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael did not do so without being told to do so, without being instructed to do so explicitly by all the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael from the time of Rabbi Hillel HaNasi, who was the head of the Sanhedrin in the 4th century. From that time onwards, the Jews were told by their Chachamim, by the Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael, by all the Geonim in Eretz Yisrael in later generations, to keep Rosh HaShana for one day, and that is in fact what they did. That historical reality, I feel, should be the deciding factor.
Does the Rav feel that there is a need to change the current practice?
With regards to what's wrong with the present system, I would mention the following points. First of all, there is the question of davening, saying the wrong tefillot on a given day. In other words, saying the tefillot for Rosh HaShana on the second day, when perhaps it is very possible that it's not the second day of Rosh HaShana at all, but rather just a regular weekday. There's the question of wearing tefillin or not wearing tefillin on that day. There's the question of barachot levatala. And there's also the question, I think, of whether people in fact enjoy and benefit from keeping Rosh HaShana for 2 days. I know that some people will tell you, I've heard such statements from the mouths of certain people, that they love Rosh HaShana, they love having 2 days, and they wouldn't give up on having 2 days of Rosh HaShana and going to shul and singing the tefillot and the piyutim. And some people I've even heard claim, perhaps they were joking, I'm not quite sure whether they were serious or not, that not keeping 2 days would be a problem, because then the piyutim that the Ashkenazim customarily say on the second day, they wouldn't know exactly what to do with them. But the fact remains that this was not the position of Chazal. Rabbi Yohanan, the famous Rabbi Yohanan of the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Eruvin Perek Gimel, states explicitly that keeping 2 days of Yom Tov in the Golah, in other words, keeping 2 days when 1 day is sufficient min Torah, he says is a punishment. It's a punishment for not having kept 1 day of Yom Tov when they were in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, keeping 2 days is not some kind of not like winning a jackpot. It's not some kind of a prize or extra benefit that one is lucky enough to have received. Rabbi Yohanan relates to the second day of Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz as a punishment, or as something at least of no intrinsic value. In fact, he goes further. He goes on to say that Jews in Chutz La'aretz think that by keeping 2 days of Yom Tov, they are receiving sachar, reward, for keeping Yom Tov for 2 days. He goes on to say that's not the case. They only receive sachar for keeping 1 day, even though they're actually keeping 2 days. It seems clear to me that Rabbi Yohanan would say the same thing about keeping Rosh HaShana in Eretz Yisrael for 2 days if it's unnecessary to do so. he would say that you may think that you're doing a good thing, or this is a wonderful thing by keeping 2 days, when in fact it's only a kind of punishment, or it's only a kind of vestigial and over some kind of archaic and vestigial reality going back to ancient times, when in fact there is no need and no purpose for this practice. So it's not at all clear that there is any advantage to keeping 2 days, whereas there are a number of arguments, such as those that I mentioned, which would indicate that this matter could and should be evaluated anew.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. And a word to our viewers. If you would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with Rabbi Bar-Hayim in honor or memory of a loved one, or if you would like to obtain Berkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.